I've been working with schools around the United States to try to make schools more kid-centered, learner-centered. We work with schools taking whatever the unique characteristics of that community, the faculty, the student body, and try to figure out what do you want your children to be? What do you want for them in the future? And then to say, if that's what you want, how does the school day contribute to that?
Ira Socol has lived one of the most fascinating lives I've encountered so far on this podcast. From his struggles to read as a child, to becoming a New York City police officer, to doing tech work in the police department, to leading innovation in public education systems across the US. Ira's path simply defies convention. It's a life marked by persistence, disruption, and the unrelenting belief that schools can and must serve every learner better. He brings to this conversation a really rare combination of lived experience on the margins of education, yet some really deep knowledge of the system itself, and the courage to say what many are really afraid to. He studied architecture, assistive tech, special education, and even criminal justice. He's written books, led district innovation work, and has radically reframed how we think about equity and learner autonomy. In this episode, we talk about the structural flaws of the education system through Ira's powerful new book called Designed to Fail, A History of Education in the United States. We also discuss what Ira learned as a student attending a then radical student-led school designed in collaboration with none other than Neil Postman. Ira goes on to discuss his experiences as a school leader and what happens when students, not systems, lead the design of learning. This podcast is certainly my longest to date, and it was essentially because I was mesmerized by Ira's life, his deep knowledge of the history of public education in the United States in particular, and his critiques of its design and structure, but yet his optimism that change is not only possible, but already happening in pockets across the globe. So without further ado, I present you with my conversation with Ira Socol. Ira, welcome to the podcast. Can you tell me where this podcast finds you today?
At home in Waynesboro, Virginia, we're just west of the Blue Ridge Mountains and east of the Alleghenies. And it's a beautiful day here, kind of a little crisp and cool, but gorgeous sunny day.
Well, excellent. Ira, at this point, I would have given you a proper introduction, but can you give the audience an overview about your work?
I've worked in education since 1995. I have a previous life before that, but and over the last, I'm thinking 7 years now, I've been working with schools around the United States, but including a couple in Canada that we've worked in and a couple of outposts in Europe, to try to make schools more kid-centered, learner-centered, built around things. We work with schools taking whatever the unique characteristics of that community, the faculty, the student body, and try to figure out what the question we always ask is, what do you want your children to be? What do you want for them in the future? And then to say, if that's what you want, how does the school day contribute to that? And what we find when we do that, and schools start to do that, kids start to want to come to school because they're suddenly seeing it as relevant and interesting and connected to their life. And so we've worked with whole states like Nevada and Kentucky. We've worked with individual school districts, and we've worked with individual schools um, to help people make this transition. It's when I retired from the school district I worked in, I didn't want to stop working for kids, which is the way I look at it. So I'm doing this.
Well, we're certainly going to jump into that because it's one of the big reasons I wanted you on the podcast is to examine this question of why, what's the purpose behind school. But let's start with you. Let's end your biography. Where and when did you grow up?
So I'm old. I'm one of those end of the baby boom kids who didn't get any of the benefits of that because we left high school into, a sort of economic disaster of the 1970s. I grew up just outside the Bronx in a place called New Rochelle, New York. It's on Long Island Sound. It's a very, very old 17th century community. I lived right in the downtown. I describe to people that my block had 2 supermarkets on it, so that gives a sense of the urban nature of it. It was an interesting school system because it was very individualized. Each elementary school, and there were when I started school 12 elementary schools in a 10 square mile city, everyone sort of reflected exactly the population, the ethnic mix that lived there. And so I will say that the one I went to was probably the one where you saw the most attempts at invention going on. And as I've written in the past, whatever my problems were there were people who were trying to solve it. They didn't know how to, they didn't know what was going on, but they were trying.
So outside of school, or maybe even if you want to answer this within the context of school, how did you and your friends play as children?
I think we'd probably have been perceived as sort of a troublemaking gang. I always had friends. I wasn't isolated. And one of the advantages of living in a very urban place is there are lots of kids around. There are lots of things. And what was great about New Rochelle was, you could pick your thing. We could be playing on the roof of the downtown mall, which we figured out how to get up to, or we could be down on the water, all within like a 8-block rate area, so we could move around. We played a lot of pickup sports. Because it was my thing, swam the huge amount, and some of my friends did that as well. But we played basketball, we played soccer, we played, touch football, we played a lot of baseball. Mostly it was completely unsupervised play. I grew up as much more like a Gen Xer, as a latchkey kid. None of my friends had a parent at home during the day. So we were just sort of free, which was in many ways really wonderful.
Yeah, I have this vivid memory of throughout middle school into early high school, those summers just feeling endless. They parents didn't care where you were. No one ever got brought home doing too much trouble or anything like that. Is there, maybe it's that quality or something else, but is there anything about your upbringing that you wish kids today could have?
Well, there's lots that I hope kids today don't have, but I know many of them do. But there are things that I think were great about the time and the place. The proximity to New York City, and yeah, we had to sneak through the back door of the bus so we could get to the subway and go under or over the turnstiles. But without any money, we could get to anywhere, which was amazing. You know, we could go to museums if we wanted to. We could play in Central Park. We could wander Wall Street. We did all those kind of things. And I think the ability to absorb all that, to see all the different kind of people that make up a city like New York, was the ultimate learning experience. And I appreciate that kids now have access via the internet to be able to see the world, but there's something amazing about living it and breathing it. And also, to go back to that freedom thing, I learned how to make decisions, very, very early in my life. I knew how to keep myself safe. I knew how to keep control of my environment and stuff. That often clashed with teachers and administrators in schools, but learning all those things early, I think really, really helps.
So we'll turn to your formal education in a second, but when it comes to just learning in general, what was the first thing you remember loving to learn?
That's really interesting because it never worked out for me. But one of the things that I really loved learning to do as a little kid was to skate. My father was a hockey player. It's not like there was pressure to follow him in that, and turned out I was much faster in liquid water than on frozen water. But there was this, sort of wonderful art of this process. I remember a whole bunch of us kids. My father would skate backwards around the lake, and he'd have like 10 or 12 of us chasing him, around, and at first using the hockey stick to balance, and then going on. And what was great about that was it seemed such a communal thing. There were a whole bunch of us. It was, and one of the great things, and I think this is true of a lot of things we learn, is as you watch your ability to get better, you never want to stop trying to get better. So it's always this constant learning and assessing yourself. Where am I, and copying other people, to try to do stuff. So yeah, that's, I think, one of my great first memories of that.
Well, as a fellow Canadian, that's a great example. When I come to think of it, learning to skate is something that requires a lot of patience, and the gains are incremental. But once you, like you described, once you start figuring it out, it becomes addicting. And I think it's a great metaphor for learning in general. So tell me a little bit about your formal education. What was education like in New York at that time?
I think in many ways it had, educators had a lot more freedom back then. I mean, New York State was always a testing state. They gave their first statewide test in 1867, so they were, they're real, sadly, leaders in this whole process. But people weren't paying attention to the thing. Parents weren't paying attention to what was going on. Politicians weren't paying attention to it. People could do what they wanted to do. My elementary school was over 1,200 kids. It was, massive place. We had 5 or 6 classes for every grade. I remember, I actually do have these vague memories of kindergarten, and thinking I was pretty successful there. I had all the playground skills. I wasn't good at napping, but everything else seemed to go pretty well. But in first grade, um, I'll quote my oldest sister, who was a teacher for many years, when she said, now we know what was going on. Back then, we just thought you were stupid. Um, I just could not make sense of the printed or written language. I mean, letters made no sense to me. I would stare at the page and get absolutely nothing, which was so weird because I knew even then that I could see something, an image, and remember it and hold it and figure it out. But these little scribbling things that people were doing and wanted me to do just didn't work at all. So I couldn't read and I couldn't write. And when now this starts to happen to kids when they're in preschool. But so in first grade, you run into this problem, that's the business of the school, is getting you to read. And when you can't do it, and so it's, the first thing that happens when you're in that situation is you start to get separated out from the herd. Okay, now you go, we're going to read this book. You go down the hall with whoever, and immediately then you are labeled because the adults label you, and that becomes who you are, to your peers and everything else. And so it got pretty brutal. I had a couple of very good teachers who really tried, and I had a couple of really terrible teachers who, would hit, which was okay back then with people, and treated me terribly. And then I remember one teacher who pointed out to me that if I knew what, NYN meant on the back of a baseball card, that was the Mets, that I was somehow reading, even though I didn't think I was. So she's probably the first person who said, it's sight words. It's not, stop trying to pay attention to the individual letters. But, my scribbling has always been incomprehensible even to me. I think what's important about this is that when you're a kid, kids need to be good at something. Somehow that's your identity. I mean, it's a little less true of adults because they're a little less obsessive about it. But for children, where your social relations are sort of existential, it's really critical. If the only thing you can be good at in school is being a pain in the butt, that's what you're going to be good at. In which case, the whole relationship with the school starts to go right downhill, because now you're not just you're just not stupid. You're a behavior problem at the same time. And I think as long as I was in, sort of an elementary school, which was up through sixth grade, because teachers saw you for a long time, if you had a good teacher, you could be protected from a lot of things. But when I hit middle school, like the world fell completely apart. Here you're supposed to be doing this reading and doing this stuff and following these rules, and you're just sitting in class. You don't have access to any of the information that, people are throwing at you. And so, you become a little crazy. But the good news about that kind of craziness is that by the time I was going to high school, I was told I was going to an alternative high school because, school was not working for me. But in this stroke of amazing luck, and I'm not sure how many people listening out there really know the name of Neil Postman, but that alternative school had just been taken over by a couple of very radical local teachers, and they designed the school with Neil Postman as a school without walls. Um, we had, and it was the absolute thing all of us kids needed. One of the teachers later described it as taking all our excuses away from us. They would say, well, you say, I hate that teacher, then don't take it with that teacher. You say, I don't like the time of day, well, then don't do it at that time of day. Whatever you say, all they said was, you have to figure out a way to get the credits New York State demands. And that could take lots of forms. I mean, my first English class, again, you have the reading writing problem, right? The English teacher and one of the leaders of the program connected me with a late night local radio news guy. And I would go work with him 3 nights a week from 10 p.m. to 2 in the morning. And I learned to interview people, to edit, to do all this stuff, all via audio. It was absolutely amazing as a lesson in things. And that school doing that let me figure out how to survive in the world, how to move through it, in a much more successful way. I never would have gone to college without that. Never, would have even thought of it. It really was an amazing thing. And to me, one of the things, this school existed for about 20 years in its form. It graduated 99% of its students. 95% went to 4-year colleges. And, this school was filled with kids. Don't end up in an alternative school because everything's been going well for them. But schools like that, there was one called the Parkway Program in Philadelphia, and there were a bunch that were incredibly successful, but they didn't look like school to people in power. The always thing was, what are you doing? These kids are just wandering around. They're, and it lacked enough control for the politics of the Ronald Reagan era. And the only places they've survived are in the wealthiest communities that don't care what outside politicians think.
Well, I mean, this is kind of serendipitous because Neil Postman is never too far from my desk. He's an absolute influence. For the reason for this podcast is to explore the narrative, the story of education and what it is and what it ought to be. And I know you do get into that into your book, and I definitely want to get there. But tell me a little bit more about the school. So it was like, giving students agency before that language was even around, really, in the popular discourse of educators?
I think that was the basic thing. It was insisting that you have agency because the teachers weren't going to do it for you. They just, they're, so I think about the ways I got credits. A friend of mine and I worked 1 year, few afternoons a week in the city's development office. And at one point did this sort of interview tour and ended up, drafting a plan for revitalizing the downtown. That's social studies and history and all those things, came to that. The friend I did that with is now the world's leading expert on restoring stone buildings like Angkor Wat and things like that. So he went that way. For him, it obviously had this massive impact. A bunch of us, as to get biology credit, we began a heritage farm that elementary school kids could come visit in one of the parks in the city. It was, other kids went and worked in the hospital emergency room. That was a big thing, or the Parks Department's greenhouse, or um, so you had all these methods of doing things. I mean, there were classes if people wanted them. I had a whole bunch of friends who spent, their years of getting English credit in a class called Great Books, which met like one night a week in the teacher's house. And, I never read a book in high school, but I listened to people talk about them, and I sort of absorbed a ton of information. Um, there wasn't a required attendance thing. There wasn't, and that drove other people crazy that we just came and went. And this was part of a huge urban high school. And we were sort of hidden off in a cafeteria they had never used up on the third floor. But we had all this freedom. What happened, one of the teachers wrote a thing, he said, here's the thing. He quoted some philosopher saying, a man's problem begins when he has complete freedom. Because then you have to figure out what you're doing, and as you put yourself by doing these things out in the community, if you think about this with an adolescent, you learn to code switch and to alter your behavior so you're okay in a whole kind of different place than if you're in a classroom. And so the learning was just amazing on many levels. And, I have seen schools, it's a private school, but the majority of their kids would qualify for free lunch, called the Brooklyn Free School. And they're doing that right now, today. They're letting that run because it really, it does for you what adolescence is supposed to do. It forces you to figure out a way to grow up. But it doesn't tell you how you have to grow up. And I think that's the most important thing. So if I look at the friends I graduated with, and I still communicate with a lot of them over social media, or texting or things like that, people have had pretty successful lives, and we weren't people that would have been predicted to have that, but we've had pretty successful lives. I mean, many of us have had a lot of different jobs, although we have one friend who started out like sweeping the loading dock of the New York Times and has worked for the Times ever since. Now is their print production quality manager. But people went into a lot of fields that people wouldn't have expected. I ended up becoming a New York City police officer, and I'm sure I would have been voted least likely to do that. But I think what it did was it let people find their way. Pam Moran and I are working on another book right now that is going to spend a lot of time talking about desire paths, which are, and we can get into that later if you want, but it's the way of you finding your own way. Your goal may be defined and similar to what everybody else's goal is, but how you get there, you're allowed to cut across the grass. And one of the great things of my time I spent at Michigan State University is MSU is famous for never putting down a sidewalk until they watch where people walk. And so the campus, if you look at a map, it's this total chaos of things because they just look down. If kids have worn a path there, okay, that's a path.
That's user-centered design, right? And Yeah, from this is coming from one of the all-time great path cutters that's out there. Even if it's not shorter, sometimes I just want to take my
Right.
own path.
And you can do that
yeah.
in school. Yep.
Yeah.
So
Well, so that's super interesting. So what year did you start the school approximately? What time was this?
this is early 70s.
Early 70s. And so what I find remarkable about the examples you gave, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that when students are given freedom and choice, they don't pick a subject. It's almost like you all picked projects to work on and to do something through a project, which I think has a lot of value for how to structure learning today.
Well, if you think about being 14, 15, 16, are you going to say, I want to be an English major? I want to be, that's not in your brain. That's not how your brain works. You at that age, what you want to do is you want to do something, right? And so, what is it you're going to do? And I guess that is the biggest lesson that school has provided for the work I've done with kids in the years since was there's a Adam Gopnik, who's a writer for the New Yorker and whose sister is the world's most amazing child psychologist researcher. But he wrote a book where he talks about the difference between achievement and accomplishment. And he talks about achievement being a goal that other people set for you. As I said, talking to a bunch of New York educators last week. So my achievement was that I got the absolute minimum passing score on all the New York State high school exams. So that's my achievement. It was like I got out of there. But the accomplishment were things like the work with the city planning office, the work with the radio station, the farm. These are things you look at and you say, I did that. And that's how I'm proving to you that I learned something, right? I did that. I knew how to do that. But it also means that it brings all the skills together. So if you're going to do a farm in a city park, maybe the biggest learning is the political learning, because you have to negotiate this out with people who think, we're not going to let these crazy kids have this.
Right.
So it's all cross-curricular in that way. It all builds this whole set of things. And I've seen this heavily in this century when we've done that with kids.
Well, it's interesting because I'm sure someone like Postman would argue that, this idea of segmenting knowledge is a byproduct of the print era, right? And wanting to segment and classify and specialize. But what you described seems to me, even as a father, a much more natural environment for how humans learn.
It is. I watched the group, and this is probably 10 years ago now, but I watched a group of middle school kids, so 7th and 8th graders at one of the middle schools in the system I worked in. And they had a teacher science teacher who sort of said, go to it. What is it you want to do? And two kids found, I don't know, someplace in one of the downtown libraries, found a copy of the first book describing how the telegraph was invented. Now, reading a 19th century technical book is incredible. That's not science. That's incredible language skills, to move through it. But they went through that book and they recreated this telegraph set. And to make it 21st century, they 3D printed all the parts that were wood in the original. So it was like, but then at a key moment, we stretched a wire across a big parking lot that separated the middle school from elementary school. And we had them sending Morse code across the elementary school, where, in a classic thing, a bunch of fifth graders were on their phones using an app to translate Morse code into English so they could understand what was going on. But this whole process was amazing because it's history, it's language, it's science, it's the math involved in it. And they ended up bringing their thing to the Smithsonian and having this, long day with the people there. Another group, sort of inspired by that, but having a totally different interest, wanted to do, one of those high altitude balloon projects. Well, we're in Virginia, and by train, we're about 2.5 hours south of Washington. We're in the dullest airspace. If you're going to put a balloon up at any height, this is a national security issue.
Sure.
And I say again that the science of creating the balloon and doing all the experiments they put in it and, setting this all up was amazing. But more amazing was watching, this was a group of young women negotiating with the dullest tower.
So they're not accused of being the Chinese spy balloon, right?
Right. And so when you see this kind of stuff happening, you see so much learning going on, and it's so positive. And the trick is then, as an adult, is how do you provide the just-in-time support kids need when they get stuck with something? So another young man, a high school student, and our district didn't include Charlottesville because that's not the way things work in Virginia. You're either in a county school district or a city school district. But we surrounded Charlottesville, and we had the famous, very fine people rally, neo-Nazi rally here. And there was a young man who was in maybe one of the most amazing high school theater programs I've ever seen. And the director of it actually got a Tony Award a couple of years ago. So I'm not the only person who thinks that. The main thing was this incredibly diverse group of kids. And this was a young Black student who was trying to write a play about police on Black violence. And I had spent a bunch of time with him because he wanted some sort of police perspective, and I started giving him some of that. Although I'm pretty radical from that point of view. Anyway, over the summer, we had this, this insane violence that happened the weekend before school started. He decided to build that into this play he was doing. And the students in the theater program voted that was the play they wanted to do for the fall. And as they put it together, they started, feeding out on Instagram and Facebook and everything else, promotion for this stuff, which included a big backdrop that had like America spelled with KKK in it and, things like that. A bunch of people in the community sort of flipped out about this and said to the superintendent, you have to stop it. And she said, no, we say we want our kids to have voice, agency, and influence. We can't say we want you to have that except when it's controversial.
Also, freedom of speech, baby.
Right,
Right.
So this play goes on, and, with the help of me and their teacher involved, we invited the cops to the dress rehearsal. And they loved it because really what the play was about was two kids, one whose friend had been killed and the other whose father was a police officer. So they did this play, and the response was so incredible. University of Virginia asked them to come perform the play there, a downtown theater asked them to come and do the play there. They won the award for the state theater competition. They actually did a little part of it up in New York at one point. And 6 months later, the local newspaper said the biggest help at healing the community after this had been this kid's play. This was a kid who was just entering 11th grade. And he transformed his community because we gave him the freedom to do that.
And that's an amazing story.
Yeah.
So you've actually sort of anticipated some of my later questions about some of the great things you've seen in education, but take me back, Ira, through, and we'll come right back into your work and the things you've seen. Mm-hmm. But take me through going through that. It was a high school, right? The Postman. Yeah. Let's call it the Postman High School, for lack of a better way to phrase that. But you get involved in all these really interesting projects, and it sounds to me like you feel a part of a community of learners. And then you go to college, or you become a police officer after that?
Then I went to college, and I went to Michigan State, and that's another story. But they got me there. I mean, one of the great things about it was they sent me a pre-filled out application. So all I had to do was sign my name. It was like the best thing ever.
How do I get those? I missed that. I missed the boat on those ones.
It's like, okay, yeah, I'll do it then. Well, it got me out of my hometown, which was probably really healthy for me. But I was a terrible student. I was, that's not true. I became a studio art major because I really did enjoy art, and there were no books to read in that, it was all very good. And I 4-pointed all my art classes, and I failed virtually everything else. But I spent 4 years doing that, and the art was great. And a school like Michigan State, where your major makes up more than half your credits, I still was running like a slightly over 2-point GPA with this amazing strategy. And I mean, I have a lot of friends from there. That was a really positive experience in a whole bunch of ways. It had, it forces you to grow up in a different way when you shift areas of the country as radically as that was, especially back then when the areas of the U.S. were much more distinct in culture than they sometimes are now. I mean, the language was very different and things. Again, it's this thing where what you get out of it is not coming from academic classes. What you get out of it, just like high school, people don't really remember much of the content of college. They remember their experiences there. And my experiences were really powerful. If I think about just discovering the Great Lakes, in a big way. I mean, what a learning experience that is, as when I realized I couldn't sort of keep going there forever, and not making any progress toward graduation, I went back to New York, and a friend talked me into, he said, well, you should try architecture school. I want to go there, and you should come with me. And so I did. We both went to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. And Pratt was a great place in a lot of ways. It was very contextual. It didn't have a style basis. It was very committed to being in the city. And Brooklyn was not what people think of Brooklyn right now. Nobody was branding themselves Brooklyn or naming their daughters that back then. People wouldn't cross the bridge to.
It wasn't the cool place to be yet.
No, it was it was pretty crazy place because it was incredibly poor. And what happened to me there, though, was that I started to realize that I didn't think architecture was going to be my way of impacting the world. Now, my friend went the whole route, and actually, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's father, they
Mm,
went afterwards and worked at in a community architecture place, helping people renovate things and stuff like that. So he went that route. I met a whole bunch of New York City cops because one of my jobs I had then was to give what they called the safety tours for new students.
mm.
Don't turn this corner, don't go to that subway station, those kind of things. And
Useful
um,
advice before there was the internet, right?
right, it's
Yeah.
really important
Yeah.
advice, you know. And they convinced me that I should take the civil service exam, and I said, well, this is going to be really difficult for me. And they said, no, because now they're trying to diversify, and they'll give you all these supports to help you take it.
Hmm.
So I did that. They tutored me and helped me and read to me and did all this stuff for like 6 months. I did really well on the test, which was mostly a test of sort of memory, can you put these two ideas together? And went to the police academy, which was the most supportive place I had ever run across. It seems very
Hmm.
odd, but
Hmm.
they were willing to help out with everything for me in that way. And in a class of almost 1,800 cadets, I finished second.
Amazing.
It's like the first academic triumph of my life,
Isn't that
and
funny how one institution is like not prepared for you at all, and then an institution like the police force then provides you with everything you need to excel?
well, I mean, one of the things they said was, we're not paying you to read. That's not
Right.
not what we need you to do. That's not really your job,
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and my police experience was fairly insane. This is the 1980s in New York. It was, and I won't get into it, but I did it. I got hurt a bunch of times, which is okay, except now I'm paying for it in a big way. But that's what happens. And I really appreciated the people I worked with and what I was doing. I started in the
Mm.
pre-Giuliani NYPDs where, the police academy included, I have 12 State University of New York credits in constitutional law from the police academy. So, I'm proud of what I did. I have my little citation somewhere in the basement.
Yeah, but I have to ask. I have to ask, Ira, because like this is a whole foreign universe to me here. What was it like? Give us some context as to what it was like being a cop in New York in the '80s. That sounds a little bit like the Wild West.
It was the Wild West. I mean, one of the things about it is that you simply couldn't keep up with things. A lot of the precincts, including one I worked in for a while, could be on a weekend backlogged 100 911 calls at a
Mm,
given moment,
mm,
and you'd say, what are you supposed to do? Drive around and yell out the window, stop that. Don't do that anymore. I mean,
mm,
your whole goal is to get to those calls, but when you're flooded like that, um, it's really it's really difficult. And the police department was just rebuilding in size after they had basically not hired cops for 8 years after the
mm,
city's bankruptcy.
mm,
And the police force had shrunk by 14,000. um, so it was incredibly understaffed, um, and the pressures on it were really amazing. I will say that I think we were a lot more approachable. We didn't look like RoboCop the way police
mm,
officers dress these days. I mean, we had bulletproof vests, but had to be under your shirt. They couldn't be visible. We weren't carrying multiple weapons around with us. We were, and there was, pretty good community service in that. I had emergency medical training that I had gotten sort of somewhere along the way. And so my partner and I, who also had that, we had a big medical kit in the back of the car. We could do stuff. Before that, I had a brief period of working undercover, which I always said they picked me because they thought I could lie really well, which I thought was okay. Everybody's got their skills, right?
Well, it's probably that street smart part that you're talking about, surviving middle school.
Right. Well, that was people think it looks cool on TV. It's not. It's not. The scariest, most horrible thing.
It's stressful.
Anybody could put you into.
I could imagine.
And
so were you there like undercover for drug kind of related things?
For gun stuff.
Guns. So it's even scarier stuff.
Illegal guns. Gun trafficking. When I talk about it, I talk about the art of waking up in character. Like
a method actor.
Who am I supposed to be that, as I wake up in the morning? But so the three phases, there's that phase, then there's the precinct phase, which I did, as crazy as it was, I did really enjoy it because, you do help people. You deal in a situation like that, you're far more likely to spend your time with victims than with criminals. And so you're doing what you can for people. But I got hurt a bunch of times. I had both sort of knees taken out and various things. And during one of those recoveries periods when they didn't know what to do with me except send me to physical therapy 5 days a week, and they're trying to figure out what else I could do. The police department was conducting this experiment. They sent like 10, this is a long time ago, IBM PCs out to a bunch of precincts and said, what can you do with these? And somehow, because I had nothing else to do, they made me precinct computer coordinator. It's a great title. And they gave me a closet that I could work in. And and I don't know how I figured this out. I remember going downtown to IBM's building and just listening to these guys talk and explain things to me for, a couple of weeks. And I came back up and I started building databases. And, the first one was simply the precinct roster. That's easy. And then the precinct activity, and that was easy. But then I started a thing that I called Crime Track, which was a database where you'd put all this information in, and then you could look things up to find similar events that had happened. This is all in writing the queries, right? So you say, I want to see everything that happens in this sector when it's raining after midnight, and you could put that in and look for stuff. People downtown saw it and fell in love with it. They didn't really fall in love with me so much, but they fell in love with with what I was doing. And I thought that was great, but I'll tell you, I didn't become a cop and wasn't working for what was then pretty lousy money to sit in an office, which has never been my style anyway. And I had a young child, and I said, I'm done. I'm sort of out of here, and took what they gave me for leaving, which included a bunch of stuff for the injuries and stuff, and went to Western Michigan. It was the only other state I'd lived in, and tried to bring my kid back in time to let him have this earlier childhood in a place they could run free and do everything. So And that's when I started getting into education.
Mm. And so you start off by becoming a teacher?
Well, no, I didn't start off with becoming a teacher. I started out going back to college to try to get a degree, and at first, to get a degree in education to become a teacher. But I was at a place called Grand Valley State University. It's sort of west of Grand Rapids in Michigan. And I had a kid to support. I was a single parent. So I was working on campus, and I was working for the IT department, but I was stringing cable at first, which was, I kind of like that. We called ourselves tech monkeys, and we had a lot of fun. But one day somebody said there was a project going on that a couple of profs were running. There was about ADHD college students, and I've always been that. That's sort of my career would indicate. Back in the days before there was timed release Ritalin and stuff like that, one of the questions was, can you figure out when you should be taking the drugs and when not to? When should you? And so they were trying to track things. And in one of the strangest weeks of my life, they had, some young woman grad student following me around all week on campus, marking down what I was doing every 20 seconds. It was a little spooky. After that week, I met with these people, and they said, you never seem to take notes. Maybe taking notes would help you pay more attention. And I thought, okay, notes, okay. And probably for the first time in my life, I went out and bought a notebook. It wasn't a sketch pad. I came back the next week, and they said, well, how'd that work? What did you do with your notes? And I said, do with them? You told me to take them. And we looked at them, and they were completely illegible. And they said, do you know what this says? And I said, no. There were a few pictures that I understood, but there was nothing else. And these two women became the best special ed teachers I've ever had, because they really, using the stuff we now had in the 1990s and the late 90s, could say, okay, this is really what's happening with you. This is how your brain is functioning. I mean, one of the things they did was an eye tracking test where they said every time I looked at a page, I looked at the middle and started moving around in a circle trying to figure it out. They said that, of course, works great for images, is not going to work, for reading. And one of them finally said, there are computers that read to blind people. Why aren't there computers that read to you? And I went to my boss in the IT department and said, can you give me a laptop? I want to try this. And he listened to me, and he said, this was amazing. He said, if this would work for you, it would probably work for a whole lot of other people. So he paid me for a year to do nothing but experiment with software and hardware for disability stuff. And
I've
to
heard
design
rumors of these kind of gigs that people got. I've never got one of these.
Yeah, this was absolutely amazing. I mean, I helped out in many other ways as needed, but it was a phenomenal experience. And I discovered back then a program that had been invented by a spin-off of NASA out in Mountain View, California, called WINN, What You Need Now, WYNN. And it was the first text-to-speech engine designed exclusively for dyslexics. So all picture menus and, none of those weird blind keys that blind people need, but just this straightforward visual interface that, tracked, highlighted the word it was reading, highlighted the sentence it was reading in a different color, so dual highlighting. it was expensive back then. It cost $1,000 a license, but it changed my life completely. Suddenly I could grab text and operate with it. They also, and one of the profs was Canadian. She had done her PhD research at UBC on kids who were dyslexic, first in Chinese, and then when they moved here in English. And one of her things that has always really influenced me is that, what she discovered is it's the same. People think it has a lot to do with letters, but it doesn't. It's, and she also taught me what I thought are better ways and quicker ways of analyzing what kids are doing. And so I took that and started working in a school system doing exactly that, diagnosing kids. And
I see. So there's your entry into the system.
There's my entry. Right.
Very interesting. So right from the get-go, you've been working with kids with special needs.
Right. And, at one point, a few years later, I also worked with, I did a bunch of work for the vocational rehab agency in Michigan, doing the same thing because they worked with high school kids all the time, and I could, do stuff other people couldn't. I went to a conference in Lansing in the state capital one time and presented this. Yeah, I found it recently. So sort of like rapid determination of technology needs in students seeking to attend college, and talked about what I was doing. And this professor walked up to me at the end of this and said, "You think you'd want to get a PhD here?" And I said, "No." Like, I feel like, what are you talking? Who are you talking to here? But they said, we have money for people who want to study what you're doing. So I went there, and, I got a lot out of it. It was really difficult, but my wife, who was not my wife yet at that point, and she told me not to include this in an acknowledgement of a book at one point. But she spent like unbelievable amount of hours scanning in documents and books for me. So I could, read them. And then I taught undergrad classes for people becoming special ed students. And I was doing that when Pam Moran, who was the superintendent in Albemarle County, who I met actually on Twitter, she said, "You have all these crazy ideas about school, and you're telling my teachers on Twitter to do these crazy things." She said, "Why don't you come down and come walk my schools with me?" And so I did, and that, led to the next career.
You want to describe that career? I do want to turn to your book, but I do think it's important too for folks to understand your time now in the school districts.
Well, so the county school district we're in is about 726 square miles. So this big sprawling area with some of the richest people in the country. We had kids whose parents played polo on the weekends, and kids who didn't have running water or floors in their houses. Had this unbelievable range of socioeconomic situations. We had 26 schools. But what it gave me in particular was a real test bed. So when I was initially hired there, they called me like, I don't know, director of design projects or
Mm.
something like that. And the idea was to help drive innovation. We asked every school to come up with something they wanted to do to radically change what they were doing. And we pooled all the money that wasn't specifically allocated in January and then used it as grant money to support these things. It wasn't very much for every school. Some of them were as simple as knocking down walls. Some of them were as complex as buying computers and doing stuff, or various other things. One bilingual school wanted to send a bunch of teachers down to Central America for the summer so they could be immersed in Spanish. And I think what we started to do was really sort of remarkable. The system was in a good place to begin with. They were really trying things. But what we built was a system of, how do we keep communicating constantly about what it is we're all trying to do? So we always said, we're not scaling anything up. Our schools are so different. We got to scale across. We have these ideas that matter to us, but you figure out how you're going to do it. And we did things over the years. I eventually became like the director of learning technologies and then the chief technology and innovation officer eventually. They kept adding things to what I was responsible for. I was also in charge of libraries, which I thought was really funny. But we did stuff like our high school libraries and then our middle school libraries and our elementary became these wild places where kids could come and do anything. We had tools and, tech bars and hacker spaces and music construction studios. And that alone, changing those libraries changed the schools because they changed the atmosphere. But we also got to do some pretty radical things. One of the things we started to do was to stop dividing kids in elementary school up by age. So we started building spaces that had K through 5 students, and a lot of them with multiple teachers in sort of spaces that we made sure were not rectangular. And letting kids have the time to progress at their rate and move forward. In secondary schools, we started doing a lot of cross-curricular things. One middle school, science and English teachers got together and ran a combined class. And we had stuff like that going all over. We tried to change the furniture, either DIY or when we had money, we spent it so that we said we wanted every classroom to have at least 3 kinds of seating and 3 kinds of table space. So kids could choose. And we said every child should be able to walk into a learning space and decide where, how, or if to sit. When we went to one-to-one computers, which we did slowly and sort of carefully, but we went with that, our kids, once they got to middle school, they were the administrators of their own computers. They could download anything, they could change things, they could do stuff. And then when we got really crazy, we developed a high school system that kids could sort of opt into, where you spent your first 2 years of high school working in a group of 60 students and 4 teachers who met all morning or all afternoon long together without dividing it up by curricular areas. And eventually the final step, which I've always been pretty proud of, is in a little ways going back to what my high school was like. We created what I call the high school without classes or classrooms. We rented space in a huge business incubator. We were actually above a brewery, which, surprise, Ira, you better go get a zoning variance for that one. uh, and built a high school where kids come in and say, this is the project I want to work on. And then it's the adult's job to figure out how to get the curriculum into that.
Well, in more than just being above the brewery, that sounds like the most fun high school one could ever go to.
The first year, in the spring of the first year, it was this Friday in the spring, and I get this text message from one of the teachers there, and he says, it's 6:30 at night on the day before spring break, and I'm trying to kick the kids out of here. And there's the difference. It was Pam Moran, who I still work with now, is an amazing leader at helping do this. But when you liberated the teachers to say, how can we do this for our kids? Teachers' creativity took off, and it wasn't me suggesting things anymore. It was them saying, oh, come look at what I'm doing, and it became this, sort of wildfire of creativity that really did change the day for kids in really significant ways. And so I'm really proud of the work we did that. And Pam and
the school district in that school, are they still going in the same way that it was when you set
I
up?
would say they haven't gone further, which often happens. There's
Right.
been sort of a plateau.
But that structure is still there, where there's that openness and that innovation.
Yes, and
That's awesome.
and that crazy high school now has over 200 kids in it every year, and it's one of the things is, even with more conservative leadership, the genie was already out of the bottle among the principals and teachers, so you're not going to really knock it down without a lot of effort, which nobody's put into that. So it's, but I reached a point when Pam was about to retire, and she'd been superintendent for 13 years, which is pretty amazing. As everybody said, well, you came here for her, so, and I could leave at that point. I had my pension in. And so then we said, well, what can we do now? We don't really want to stop. We just want to take it on the road. We thought it would be a very small, kind of casual thing that would be the retirement job, which is why I describe myself as unsuccessfully retired. It's become a pretty busy thing, but we still try to keep it small. Very few people. We want to work with people who are ready to do the work themselves, because it's not our schools, so that's where I am now.
Well, I think that's a great context to talk about your book, and perhaps at some point down the road we should talk with Pam, because I'd love to hear about the trials and tribulations of how you actually got the work done and set up some amazing programs in schools for kids. I think, like I said, this is probably a really good transition now to talk about Design to Fail, the history of education in the United States.
Hey, I can be a book hustler, and I'm really bad at that, but here it is.
No, you should be. You should be proud of it. I think it's a great book. I've spent a lot of time with it over the last few weeks. So maybe, Ira, get us started by talking about how you argue in the book that the education system was designed to fail. Can you kind of elaborate on that and describe or give us the premise of the book?
Well, this really began when I was in grad school at Michigan State, and I fell in with this strange group of people that called themselves the postmodern study group in the College of Education, which was really lunch every Thursday. But we talked about a lot of things that were sort of foundational, what I call behind the curtain things. Why do we do the things we do? What are the philosophies that play across schools? What's actually going on? And eventually I asked this very simple question. I said, if what we're doing doesn't work, why have we kept doing it? What is it that causes us to keep doing something that makes the majority of kids miserable and really fails almost all of them in some significant ways? And with the encouragement of some equally crazy professors, I had good people around me. I started researching the history of education. Now, this is something that would have been an unbelievable amount of work in the last century, but once there were Google books, I could pull up books that there was one copy of, either in New York or Harvard or the Library of Congress or whatever, and start converting these to text-to-speech and listening to them. I decided I was going to look at, okay, this is a man-made system. This didn't grow in a field, not an evolutionary thing, right? This is something that people created. And if people can create it, then people can change it. One of the great things about reading 19th century documents is they don't use euphemisms. They say exactly
very true.
What they think.
Mean, what they mean, and what they think. Yes.
There's no beating around the bush, as they say with their stuff. So, I looked at stuff that, the usual suspects like Henry Barnard and stuff like that. But one of the things I discovered was a bunch of books by a guy named William Alcott. He's from that family, who was a teacher in Massachusetts in the 1830s, 1840s, and might have been America's first grade education researcher, because he wrote these amazing books about it. The first one sounds like a porn title. It's Confessions of a Schoolmaster, but
that title certainly didn't last the test of time.
Right? But he really watches kids, and so he's actually the person who designed the classroom as we know it, but with very different intentions. He was tired of kids sitting on benches without backs. He wanted them to have desks to themselves and chairs. So as he said, when they get up, they're not kicking each other. And he believed that kids should pretty much get up every 5 minutes and should get out of the building every 20. He was really sort of devoted to that concept. And then he does the amazing thing, and people have this vision, you see pictures people do of like colonial education, and they're all sort of fraudulent. The blackboard had been brought to the United States by a guy named Crozet, whose name is on a town near us, because he was an engineer who had worked in the French military academy, taught calculus, crossed the ocean to teach calculus at West Point, and brought with him this amazing invention, the blackboard. It took about 25 years for it to get from West Point to K-12 education, but he brings it. Alcott brings it into the classroom and brings the slate in, and he intends the blackboard to be this big collaboration space where all the kids can work together and do stuff. And the slates, he said, are great. Think about when computers were introduced to the classroom, kids will write more because it's easier to erase, right? To change things. And then he has one of my favorite lines in a book that's called Blackboard Exercises, which is a 256-page book explaining to teachers how to use the blackboard, right?
Early tech adoption, man.
Early tech adoption. Tech adoption is always difficult. And he says at one point, just echoing it all, he says, about the slates. He says, but you will say, we can't give these things to kids, they'll break them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Sounds
like
familiar.
the constant thing. So I said, wait a second, there's a person there at the start saying all the right things.
Mm-hmm.
So what exactly happened? And as I started to read this, and this became the dissertation topic, you find that education, and it's as true in Canada and the British Empire as it was in the US, with a little bit difference of the driver between admittedly imperial and capitalist imperialism, but these schools arise in the 1840s for a couple of reasons. First, it's a technology revolution and a communications revolution. Before the 1840s, if you wanted news and information, it moved at the speed of a horse and a sailing ship, basically. And books were incredibly expensive. Newspapers were incredibly expensive things. And suddenly, in the 1840s, you get the railroad, you get the steamship, you get the telegraph, you get the rotary printing press, you get machine-made paper, and suddenly everything changes radically. But another thing happens. You have this, as the second industrial revolution explodes, you have all sorts of migration, either internal or external. In the US, of course, what really upset people was you had this flood of Irish immigrants that weren't Protestant and didn't speak English, and seemed lazy, all the stereotypes that, ran through the whole thing. And industrialized countries around the world wanted to basically train these people into the life they wanted them to live, to be compliant workers and compliant citizens. And they reached out to what was called the Prussian model. The Prussians were the first people to divide kids up by age. And that's because they saw it as a 10-year march, basically to train soldiers. Take kids from the age of 5 and have them be totally order-following soldiers at the by the time they might enter the military at 16. And there's always that great Marxist quote that, Prussia isn't a country with an army, it's an army with a country. But so what you have is a group of people trying to figure out how to impose a whole bunch of rules on people who are not like them. Either they've grown up in rural environments, living a very different life, or they're from the other countries, or they don't speak the language or whatever. So you start to get an interesting pattern as you watch along. In the US, classrooms begin to mimic Calvinist New England churches. They're rectangular. They have white walls. They're all focused up front entirely. Everything else is considered a distraction. Everybody's facing the same thing. Everybody's reading the same thing at the same time. And there's very little movement. And all of that, really mimics the stuff. So my question then became, okay, so they did this, but why do we still have it? And what I discovered was that as you get to the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, although there are a lot of voices against it, you basically have a group of people saying, well, because you're in this social Darwinism period, well, we've evolved into the perfect school. This is a natural thing. This is what school is supposed to be. For me, two things struck, and one was deep into it when I was at Michigan State, and one came later. The first thing is, this is, all about power and how people write about power and perceive their power in society. Later, I came to look at this as, and I think it was originally titled Authoring the System. So it was really focused on the people writing and, what they were doing. But as I started to think about, and Pam and a number of other people, a guy named Justin Bathon, who's a professor at the University of Kentucky, have been hustling me about turn this into a book for a long time. What it really is about, and I think, what I ended up focusing on is this is a wealth preservation system. Our schools are designed to make sure the children of the people who have the money and power now are advantaged. And this is a very deliberate design, and it's why you might think people are liberal, but when you really start to talk about changing schools in some significant way, you find out they're really not on board, because they want their kids to have the advantages. And so schools are designed so that if you come in, you have university educated parents with money and you've been read to since you were born and you've had all these advantages, you've been to summer camps and you've been all of that. Well, school is designed to start there and run with it. And if you don't come in with that, you are so far behind at age 5 that you could run all your life, you'll never catch up if you're trying to become what those people are, which is what school wants. If you could follow a different path, you might find success in a significant way. But if you're trying to follow their path, and one of my examples, it's a British imperial thing, it really benefited, 19th century upper class of Britain, if everyone in the colonies was spending all their energy trying to become English, to learn to drink tea correctly, to learn to do all that, because then they weren't creating revolutions. And in the US, it has a slightly different motivation, but not very different in the end.
So that's interesting, because there seems to me, at least on the surface, but maybe you have a resolution for this, a sort of paradox there, because while I think you make a very good argument in the book that that's how the education system was put into place, and that's how it's been upheld, and we can get into how that legacy still persists today. But there also seems to be a bit of a paradox there, in that school, for a lot of impoverished families, like my own included, has been like kind of the accelerant into the middle class. How do you square that, or how do you resolve that?
Well, I think right in the introduction of the book, I say, I've always said there's no such thing as a nonfiction book. Everybody is, everybody is picking and choosing the questions they ask and then how they answer them. School is can be an engine of equality, and I think about, the New York City public schools are legendary for this, amazing claim of people who came with nothing and went through it, and, until the Reagan era, New York City's city universities were free as well. So, went through this whole thing. When you look at the percentages, though, you're talking about like a 2% success rate. Most people, the vast, vast majority of people born in poverty in the United States die in poverty. It does not change for most people. And we like the stories of the successes.
Mm.
And I know this from just, the disability perspective. People love to say, oh, you're sort of like the magic kid, you overcame all this. Well,
Mm-hmm.
mostly what I overcame was adult decision making.
Mm.
So it's that kind of thing. And when you dig into a lot of stories of successes from a place like New York City, many people will talk about the public libraries more than the schools. They went to the libraries, they read all these books, they sat there and they studied and they went all this. And I think there you're seeing people choosing a path. If school works for you, that's good. If school doesn't work for you, we have an alternative, sort of open route there. And there's also the thing of, when you can find examples of that, then your ability to preserve the system stays. But I'll also say that there are groups for whom it's more likely that school will work for their kids than other groups. And most cultures around the world, for instance, did not really develop individual print literacy as an idea. It was usually a group thing in most parts of the world. And the oral tradition remains this incredibly powerful, thing in places. It's not all about reading. And so depending on the culture you come from, you're either closer or further. And that's sort of the cultural divide. My intention in writing the book was not to say schools are bad. Schools are this amazing opportunity, and I want kids in school, if only because I've always said the most important thing educators do every day is look into the eyes of their kids and say, are you okay? And this is a really important place to have, and to have that be the focus. The problem becomes, again, when you talk about the percentages. If you have a society that's so locked in socioeconomic classes across so many groups that things simply do not change for, you have to say, why? What's happening here? And you also see, and this sort of has influenced me a great deal, you see wealth pouring money into, say, schools in urban areas that they want to turn into sort of little military academies. The kids all have uniforms on, and they're all, they march in step down the hallway, and they are required to stare at the teacher all day. And, and foundations and people with money, from Mark Zuckerberg, to Bill Gates, pour money into these kind of things. They don't pour money into how can we open this up, in a giant way. And so I think that's sort of my explanation of the pattern. I'm making an argument, but I'm surely not making the only argument that could be made.
Fair enough. So maybe one way to focus is talking about the existing legacy, and I believe you kind of referred to them as like kind of the damaging anachronisms that are still in place today that are I think as you started this discussion is by saying that they're not necessarily here for any reasons other than historic reasons. Can you describe some of those?
Well, some of them are amazing because the decisions were often made like in random ways by people who often had very little to do with, primary or secondary education. The Carnegie unit in the US, that idea that seat time determines how you get credit, was invented initially as a way of requiring teachers to work a certain number of hours if Carnegie was going to help them with their pensions. I mean, even the Carnegie Foundation now says it's time to get rid of it. And I said to the head of that last time I met him, I think you should admit the fact that it was a bad idea when it was created in 1908, because educators said it was a terrible idea. You know, the superintendent of schools in Chicago, said this is like the stupidest thing she ever heard of. Why would you do that? And amazingly, back in 1954, the U.S. government issued a report. It was only the year after the idea of a federal education department was created that requiring kids to spend a certain amount of time in class was blocking all other possible changes in schools, and had to get rid of it. That's a long time ago now, because it doesn't make any sense that everybody needs to spend the same time to get the same thing. But it's based on, think about when it was developed. So 1908, Ford is saying, well, it takes 93 hours to make a Model T. And the school is saying, well, then it takes 160 hours to get your biology credit, whatever it is. But the group that created that included like 2 people who'd ever worked in, the secondary school. It was
it's amazing, isn't it?
Right. Yep. And the other thing you have that arose, a little earlier, but was still controversial in the years before World War I, was the idea of dividing kids up by age. I mean, educators fought this intensely, saying, are you kidding? You think all 8-year-olds are in the same place, that's what matters, that, it simply doesn't make any sense. And, what teachers always struggle with is trying to keep this incredible range of students who are in incredible places in their learning journey and their maturation journey, trying to keep them all in the same place. And so it's basically impossible, and that's what makes classrooms so frustrating for teachers. The example that, I give is that when the first school, which was a school that served the refugee center, among other things, where we eliminated the grades in elementary school, our pull-out special ed services vanished for those kids because they could all find their time, and do things. There are 2 other big anachronisms that I'd sort of like to bring up. One is the division of content. Again, educators oppose this, the idea that you would have separate classes for these separate subjects. Because, again, if you think about people who were educated at that time, still had this sort of Renaissance vision that, they would know all these things and have this world of knowledge, and it didn't make sense for them to divide things up. And it doesn't make sense to kids, because it's like, oh, I'm sorry, you're really interested in this novel, but now it's time to do algebra. Oh, you're interested in algebra, now it's time to, whatever. So division of content is another huge thing. And the final thing, because it's such the topic of conversation these days, is technology. Educators for all time have been resistant about any change in technology, going back to Socrates objecting to literacy, and his objections are all completely valid. You're reading something, you don't get to question the author, right? You don't get to look in the author's eyes and try to decide if they're lying or not. You don't, it's a one-way fixed thing. And Socrates was right. It's not the way humans were designed to communicate. But it also, of course, made the memory thing that people of Socrates' time thought was the key to education not so important anymore. So I take that all the way up to, the mobile phone and the smartphone, because every time there's a change in the technology of communication, and I try to make this argument in the book, cognition changes. People are trained by the media they see in certain forms of how they take information in. And if you're fighting that, you're fighting the present. You're not even fighting the future. You're fighting the present. And you're really stuck. So one of the things that happens, is that so many schools want to be in 1970. Well, I'll tell you, I was in school in 1970. I don't think that's where you want to go back to, but okay. And people have this myth that there was a golden age of education. I always tell them to watch movies like Blackboard Jungle and If, from Britain. If they think school was all working real well, a long time ago. If you're not taking kids to their world, you're really defeating them. And the other thing it's a little thing, but as someone with a disability, this is a big thing. When I first started using a computer in a college classroom, I was the only person in that room with a laptop. And people were like, ooh, what's wrong with you, kind of thing. When I went back to grad school and everybody had a computer in front of them, I didn't look different than anybody else. Maybe I was listening to something different because I was listening to the reading instead of music, but you're part of the room. And when people say, oh, well, for special ed kids, we'll certainly still let them have these things. Well, kids don't want to be separated out, especially adolescents. And, for me, my phone is everything, and like Google Lens, which reads anything to me instantly, is this amazing tool. And I don't want to use your thing. I want to figure out how to use my thing, to go forward. I think that if in the book Pam and I wrote together, Timeless Learning, one of the things we talked about was zero-based thinking. Sometimes you have to back up and say, wait a second, what are we trying to do here? And if we were starting from scratch, would we really be doing what we're doing? And I guess that's my whole basic pitch in the book, is to say, if you're not doing this for the right reasons, first I would say that we morally and intellectually disagree with almost everything the creators of the system had to say about the world, but we're doing exactly what they told us to do. And that's the why. And one of the things, and I used to bring this up in the College of Education in Michigan State all the time, and annoyed a lot of people, but we take teachers and we take them through these university classes. These kids are going to become teachers, and we're telling them to do all these creative things, but we surround them with the absolute traditional system, with the linear grades and the time thing and the division of content and
school bell, bus schedule.
Right. And so we think we're telling them to be creative, but we're really telling them to not be. And so, that's the anachronism thing, just is frustrating. And it's why I believe kids feel school is so irrelevant. It does not match what they know of the world.
Yeah. And to me, it's all coming to a head now, because it's not only the kids that we've known, I'm an 80s, 90s kid in elementary school and high school, right? And And I felt that way then, and I'm sure the kids feel that way now. There's a bigger problem looming in that, like, the tech giants are telling you, don't go to school, just come to our tech program incubator and we'll teach you the code, and you don't need to know history, and you don't need to know humanities background. You don't ever need to read, Mark Twain.
Which is exactly what J.D. Vance has advocated through his tech bro funding.
Right.
You're right. I mean, there's that going on. There's also something that I think interesting happened during partially the pandemic is true, but partially what we've been in the US, No Child Left Behind, that period, and similar things in other countries. Parents don't think kids should go to school anymore. They don't care. The Guardian had this great poll which showed that like 70% of parents in England didn't think it was important for kids to go to school every day.
Well, because they've had such bad experiences themselves, and they it really did open the window into your kid's classroom, right? When you can hear the teacher, and to be fair to the teachers, it wasn't exactly a normal environment for them. There's a lot of, and a lot of times they saw, things that reminded them probably a lot of their own education. So my question bringing this up is, and I think this does get, Ira, that's why I don't want to rush this conversation at all, is getting to the kernel or the heart, I should say, of the podcast, which is we've inherited these systems. We all know that there's a lot that still needs to change. How do we go about pushing back against a system that we've inherited? None of us have created this system, but we all take part in one way or another in perpetuating it. So what are at least the incremental ways that teachers, principals, parents, community leaders can think about making change?
I think one of the things is to really ground administrators in the idea that they're part of a community and they're part of a community's future. I wrote a blog post, I don't know, maybe a year ago, called "The Children of the Children We Lied to." So now we have the kids of this back to basics movement who, like you say, hated school. If you hated school, the chances of your kids liking school are pretty low, and then we have the pandemic. But the response, and we've done a big project in Nevada over the last couple of years where the state wanted to define what they call the portrait of a learner, which is a big, kind of thing these days. We did it very differently. It started by asking kids, what is it you want? And then from kids, we went to community members like business people and stuff like that. And then from there, we went to parents. And from there, we went to teachers. And when we really listened to that, what they were, Pam and I often, when we work with people, ask people to write down on a Post-it note, what is the most important thing you think kids should leave your school with? Nobody mentions anything academic, nobody. It's just not there. And so the whole idea is, how do you shift to what is a lot of times now being called durable skills, where you're trying to teach kids how to learn, how to operate, how to function in the world. I've seen people get started in a lot of interesting ways. And, although we ask kids to change all the time, adults in schools always say, well, you can't change too much at once, but you can start with things that start to help things. One way to think about this is to really tackle the whole concept of assessment and time. We worked with a really brilliant principal out in Las Vegas to open a new high school that is all mastery learning model. And it has lots of vocational paths, but academic stuff as well. And, but the principal talks about the whole mastery learning concept is not only difficult for kids to grasp, it's really difficult for parents to figure out. Because as he says, when you're doing mastery learning, you're not assuming that a whole bunch of kids are going to get C's and a whole bunch of kids are going to fail. You're assuming everyone is going to succeed, whatever that time is. And so you can't slide through with a C. That's not something that's available to you as an option. But it gives kids the time. And his thing is, you finish school as fast as you can, as fast as you want to, as fast as, his whole thing is, go from seat time to revenue generation, go live your life, that's one path, and it's a really powerful thing to do. But you can start even before that. An article Pam and I did in Kaplan magazine, we interviewed a whole bunch of people working in the mastery learning thing, and a guy who worked on it back in the 70s, talked about, you don't have grades like C and D, because he says, if you have those, you're assuming somebody's going to get them. You just say that's not going to happen here. And so you can change the assessment thing, because that is one of the things that creates incredible battles between teachers and kids and destroys the whole respect structure. Because when grades are given in traditional schools, they are meaningless. I think I have the famous quote from an engineering professor I had at Pratt, who said, nobody leaves here knowing 95% of what makes a building stand up. It's either something you can do. Now you have to decide then, what is it important that kids do in this situation? And it may not be that they have to read 3 Shakespeare plays. It can be, a demonstration of the fact that they can interpret literature of some sort. I mean, you decide what is it, the core principle behind that. Another thing is, and I talk about this a lot with people, about how do you stop the constant battle, especially between adolescents and adults, that go on in schools all day. So one of the first things we got big uptake on was the idea of what we call choice and comfort. You can walk into a classroom, decide where, how, or if to sit. Suddenly you're eliminating this huge number of battles that go on every day. Stay in your seat, do this,
battles about minutia, right?
About minutia, right? And what teachers realized is suddenly their discipline problems shrank by more than half just by doing that.
Yeah, because you're eliminating that challenge of authority, which is the real problem for the minor little things that you create these rules for, right?
If you think about other things, if kids can eat and drink and chew gum when they need to eat and drink and chew gum, you eliminate a whole nother set of battles that goes on. And, it's interesting. I was in a high school in Michigan. It's a high school I started out doing the technology stuff back at the beginning. And, we were walking around the school with the principal and talking to her. And, so this is a high school. And one of the things they have is they have a barista bar open for the first 3 periods of the day. Kids on their phone can order the drinks they want, which is delivered to them in the classroom. Okay, we have solved a whole bunch of problems, right? There are a whole bunch of battles. And, she said about phones, she said people have been trying to win this battle since mobile phones appeared. You're not going to do it. But it's interesting. She extended the time between classes to 7 minutes. And the school is sort of a brilliant architectural design, or it certainly was in the 90s when it was built, in that it centers on the cafeteria. With 7 minutes, all the kids gather there. They're getting drinks, they're doing stuff, they're talking to each other. We're in this space with like 1,000 kids, and maybe 6 were on their phones because they had this free time to be them, and be among their friends and their peers and in their world. Lots of this comes down to the question of how much control do you think you keep needing? And if you can start to release some of that control, and you're doing it step by step, not for the kids, but for the adults, because it's very difficult for them to do that. When we said kids could sit however they wanted to, there were a whole bunch of teachers who said it'll be anarchy. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't at all. In which case it got easier for us to make the other arguments about, how do you have things. I mean, one of the things with the technology, with kids being administrators of their own computers, yes, it was true. For 6th graders, I bet half of them in some point in the year screwed the computers up so badly we had to re-image them and take them back to start. But okay, we taught kids how to do that, and it's no big deal, except it's a lesson to the kids who've lost, as I used to say, all the music they've stolen, when that happens. But by the time they were in 9th grade, it was down to 9%. Teachers were 11%. So we thought we were okay. In other words, kids were learning to use these things and learning to use them well, which is a really relevant, critical skill, in this moment in time. Projects are another thing to tackle, but I say this with a sort of big asterisk on it, because the projects have to be real and they have to come from the kids. The science fair is ridiculous. When my son was in middle school, I used to walk around and try to buy the good ones from people so we could use them next year. It's like, because it's like that's just the test of parent, persistence. So if you assign ridiculous projects, I remember my son being asked once, all the kids in the class were assigned a country and told they had to create a plan to host the Olympics. And my kid got Madagascar. He said, you couldn't do this.
Do the marathon through a jungle.
Right, I mean, what are we bringing lemurs in? It's like
it'd be like a survival Olympics.
Right. So, but if the projects arise from the kids, like that telegraph thing, like the high altitude balloon, like the play, we have 1,000 other examples of this kind of stuff, that changes everything. Then the kid has all that motivation to accomplish something. And again, it's a giving up control, because it's the teacher saying, oh, I'm not the assigner. But we talk about projects come in 2 forms. The traditional form is an attempt to add context to content. So you want kids to learn this thing of history, so you have them do a diorama of, something, right? The other way to do it is adding content to context. That is, the kid has something they want to do, and like I said about that one in high school, you say, how do I get the content into that? And maybe our ultimate example of that was a middle school, and this was a rural middle school with real socioeconomic problems and real academic achievement problems and everything else. And it also served a bunch of segregated community elementary schools. So it had all the problems, coming in. Well, one spring, we had met an architect in Philadelphia who works with kids on sort of iterative design build projects in the community. And we asked him to come down and talk to this middle school, and he did. He came down and he said to the kids, what do you want to change in the school? And the first thing the kids brought up was they hated their cafeteria. It was a 70s building. More than half the classrooms didn't have windows, neither did the cafeteria. They're horrible, horrible spaces. And so you say, cool, you pick these 2 weeks, and it was actually 2 weeks before the big Virginia tests. And he said, well, what do you want to do with the cafeteria? And the kids said they wanted to build tree houses, rolling tree houses. And that's what they did for 2 weeks. Basically, everybody in the school worked on this project, building some of the most incredible structures I've ever seen kids that age construct. Beautiful, magnificent things with rope ladders and swings and even place for wheelchairs to get into, at least the bottom level of it, and all these things. But what was amazing about it was, first, it brought the school together. As the architect said, it was a barn raising. It was an amazing, amazing experience. But at the end of it, when the next week the kids took the state math test, for the first time in 17 years, the school passed. Mm. Kids had been using actual math for 2 weeks, measuring, cutting, dividing, figuring out ratios, doing all this stuff. Student created context. It's one of the few moments where I thought Pam was ready to kill me. We started putting up pictures on Instagram, and she was like, what are you doing? I thought you were building booths or something. They didn't want to build booths. They wanted a treehouse. The treehouses roll also, so they could be moved to different parts of the room. So you create that context. We had met a young woman at a University of Kentucky lab school in Lexington, Kentucky, a couple of years ago, and the teacher just said, I'd like you to come up with a project. It was an English class, but she said, because I want you to do the communication stuff around this, come up with a project that helps your community. And this young woman had been a refugee from sort of the Horn of Africa, had grown up in a refugee camp originally and then come to the US. And she said, well, yes, Lexington is my community, but my community really resides back there. And this girl in 3 months created a nonprofit foundation that could raise money to buy backpacks and school books and school stuff and eventually computers. And then she flew them over there.
Incredible.
To the town she came from.
And those are the sort of things that I think the classroom could be the locus for those kind of really impactful projects. And personally, that's where I see the future of education going, this like breakdown of this distinction between the four walls and the community, which I think is something that you've been advocating for here. So if I can ask you this question.
I'll just add one in. That all starts with a very small decision. It's what Pam calls getting to yes. The teacher didn't say no. Mm-hmm. All the teacher had to do was say yes. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, that doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't, do anything. All it is being willing, when you listen to kids, to say yes to what their passions are and their interests are.
And then everything else you can figure out. Yeah. Their problems that can be figured out. Okay, so I know I've taken up a lot of your time today. 2 more questions for you. One of my favorites is, if you had a magic wand and you can change anything in education and you are all powerful with this magic wand, what would you do?
I would make schools 24-hour, 7-day-a-week learning centers where kids could come when it worked for them. and work on the stuff they wanted to work on. And, you don't expect the same adults to be there all the time, but pre-pandemic, a bunch of wealthy Chicago suburbs had 24-hour schools. They were open for all those facilities that kids need to do things that they may not have at home. But it's unfortunately the wealthy communities that do it, right? The ones where you really don't have to do it. Because I think I want schools to be at the heart a couple of things. I want them to be safe places for kids who are often not safe anyplace else. I want schools to be places where kids aren't hungry because there's food available for them and they can eat, and they're warm or cool or whatever it is they need to be. But I also want them to be places where kids can operate on kid time. Adolescent time is so radically different than adult time. And we can reconceive that lots of ways. There are teachers, I'll guarantee you, especially young ones, who would happily work Wednesday and Thursday from 4 to midnight and not have to work, 2 other days of the week, right? It would be better for teachers. It would be better for kids. It would be better for parents to have those things. I know that's an incredibly radical thing that has all sorts of issues that come around it, but that's my aspirational goal is learning, community learning centers, which is what I really want schools to be.
Wonderful. It's a wonderful idea. As always, the last question, Ira, what podcast, book, video, movie, music album, doesn't have to be one of all the above, but anyone that you would recommend for the audience?
Let me suggest 2, and I'll briefly say this because one's old and one's new. But I think it's really important for people in education to understand people who are really, really not like them. One is a book, it's probably 30 years old now, called Borderliners. It's by Peter Hoag. He's Danish. And it's a book about an early and horrible inclusion attempt at a boarding school in Denmark that goes completely wrong because you're trying to fix kids instead of solve their problems for them or help them solve their problems. And it's incredible. It's basically about 3 kids, and their voices are so genuine and so authentic. This is something that, nonfiction can't really capture, but fiction can. When you're writing about this, the intensity of how alone and off these kids are. But I used to assign it to undergrads in Michigan State, parts of it at least, because I would say to them, yeah, you want to help everybody, but you have 3 kids who they describe themselves as damaged, incredibly damaged, right? Kids who have a real problem at this point because what the world has done to them functioning in society. So exactly how are you going to operate around them? The other book, and it's very recent, and it's from Ireland, north of Ireland, in fact. It takes place in Belfast. And it's sort of one of those, what they call autofiction now. It's definitely autobiographical in inspiration. But so you have a young man who's escaped from total poverty and the troubles in West Belfast and the violence and all this stuff. He has made it. He's achieved it. He's like the only kid one of maybe only 2 kids in the community that he knows who's gone to university, and he's actually gone to Britain and gone to school in Liverpool. He's achieved everything, right? But he comes back home, and it's after the late 2000 aughts collapse of the economy. And as his friend says to him, you're in exactly the same place you would have been if you hadn't even bothered to graduate from high school. You're stuck in this exact same world. And what I think is really important about that is for people to understand that you're lying to kids if you say all you have to do is work hard at school and things will happen for you, because kids know better than that, especially kids in poverty, kids who are marginalized populations. As somebody we worked with, actually the third co-author of Timeless Learning, worked in one really difficult community in Virginia before he came to us, and he said, he had kids every year killed in drive-by shootouts. So what do you say? You can't say a kid, you work hard, you're going to succeed, when they know they could get shot the next day outside the, while they're walking to the store. And it's not that I want to harp on that, because that's, schools should be an optimistic place. But it's so important for people to know that kids come to school with a million different things on their minds that are far more legitimately important to them than any of the content we're trying to teach. The world is a really hard place for an awful lot of kids right now. And their trust in adults is sort of at a zero level. I've said a number of times to people, we've done a lot of work to prove to our kids that we're idiots. We really seem to be, especially in the U.S., we're really working overtime on that. And so it's really important for people to focus on what's the kid's perspective on life, on their daily life, on how they view their future, on how they view their world. Because it's not our vision. We have to stop having education that's focused on social reproduction and on reproduction of the past. Education should be about what's next. One of the things when I present sometimes, I show a timeline. I just say to people, what year are we in? Kids who are who entered kindergarten this year, they're only going to be 80 at the beginning of the next century. We need 22nd century learning, and we're trying to get out of 19th century learning. So I guess those are my two suggestions. The book from Ireland is called Close to Home by a guy named Michael McGee. It's also a radical writing attempt. There are not only no speech tags in it, there are no quotation marks. He just lets it all flow and go, and understand that communication has lots of new ways it can happen. I'd advise teachers, for example, to read that book and then listen to the audiobook, because they may learn that the audiobook transmits a ton more information because it gives you the accents that dominate, that are class indicators. So anyway, those, that's my thought.
Well, with that, Ira Socol, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Jason. It's been great talking to you.
This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.